Okay, so we're going to get started with the final lecture of this morning. I appreciate your stalwart character listening to all of this, bearing with the depth of so the concepts being discussed, if not all aspects of the material. Within this lecture, I'm going to be hitting on this issue of the relationship between dynamic models on the one hand and statistical models on the other. And once again, this is a lecture that I've created for this event. And I thought it would speak to some of the needs that I sensed. I give this lecture with a certain amount of trepidation for a couple of reasons. First of all, while I apply statistical methods quite extensively, I'm not a statistician. Second of all, statistical field is one that's evolving very quickly. And when we talk about a statistical model, what it means now is actually quite a bit more nuanced than what it meant 20 years ago. And I'm keenly aware, partly because I'm helping to contribute to some methodological advances in statistics that are bringing it closer to dynamic modeling. I'm actually really excited about these. It's not two solitudes that are in competition, anything like that. These are techniques that are deeply complementary and supportive of one another. But I felt that I was motivated to give this talk because there's a lot of persistent confusion that people have when they first encountered dynamic modeling, often because they have been educated in programs, MPH programs for epidemiology, other aspects of the health sciences, which expose them to statistical methods. And that's kind of how they're used to thinking about things. Those are the methods they're used to applying. And then when they come and get exposed to dynamic modeling, the natural question is, well, how is this different from the models we use already, right? It's a very natural question. We already use models, statistical models, in our work, and they can be extraordinarily powerful. Use quite a bit survival analysis, competing risks analyses, great stuff. And in more recent types of modeling, stepwise, and needless to say, standard techniques like stepwise regression or ANOVAs and various types of hypothesis testing. These are great things, but how are dynamic models different than that? And really, what I'm trying to do is to sort of highlight broad differences without claiming that somehow these fields are forever different. Statistics is evolving quickly, and things that are being done in computational statistics now, as I say, are rather different from your run-of-the-mill statistics that many of you would have seen in school. But I'm trying to highlight these sort of broad differences compared to techniques you would have seen a lot of before, not to talk about inherent differences that will forever keep these approaches separate. So I'm talking kind of more traditional statistics here. Now, one thing to emphasize up front is traditional statistical models and dynamic models are not in competition or in conflict at all. These are not pretenders for the same throne. These are not different competing ways of answering the same questions. They're actually best used for somewhat different things. And both, in fact, jointly contribute to a successful dynamic modeling project. Our dynamic modeling projects have been hugely helped by statistical analyses that we've done as part of them. So it's not you do either dynamic modeling or you do statistics. No, you do both, but each addresses different needs. So I really want to try to help understand where each fits in. The distinction that Jeff often likes to use, and I have a certain amount of trepidation myself, but I think maybe it's the sensible way to view it. He distinguishes between analytic approaches and synthetic approaches. Now, this is somewhat in sort of tension with the common use of analysis or analytics. I think of dynamic modeling as a type of analytic approach. But Jeff likes to distinguish between analytic approaches, which take things apart and try to make sense of them in that way, versus synthetic approaches that put things together and understand the implications. Again, it's not the primary division I use, but it is one that he found very helpful. And analytic approaches here, as in the statistical approaches, say with regression, focus on characterizing how different covariates associate with some dependent variables. So we have some dependent variable, we have some independent variables, and we look at the associations between the two. Maybe it's a linear regression, maybe it's a logistic regression. We have various forms of it, but fundamentally they're these covariates, and we're interested in how they contribute, say, to a dependent variable. And when people go to dynamic models, this is often what they have in mind. How is this different from a regression? And fair question. So this is one of the sort of things I'm trying to compare to. Dynamic models are synthetic in the sense they characterize how causal interaction different variables give rise to behavior as a whole, of the system as a whole. Okay, now the foundational point, which I emphasized yesterday, and I think is really central, is this idea that, look, from a dynamic modeling perspective, and I think from a critical realist perspective, empirical observations about the world, the evidence that we have, that we gain access to, these are the reflections of underlying processes in the world. There's some processes out there that we don't necessarily observe, processes involving health, processes involving some aspects of care seeking, processes involving social support, all these sort of factors that are giving rise to the empirical data we do collect. But the point is there's a lot going on under the covers. There's a lot going on out there that we don't directly have evidence of. We don't directly observe it in our data sets. So what's posited here is there's some underlying causal structure to this system. And Jeff, Jeff and Joachim both have amazing grasp of philosophical concepts. Jeff tells me that this is linked in with critical realist thought and the difference between the actual and the realized world, or there's some different notion. The notion is that the world we observe is just one possible realization of. It could be slightly different due to the vagaries of the stochastics involved. There could be something a little bit different, the results. The point is there's some causal structure underlying things. And we observe certain components of that, but not most of it. There's lots of latent factors evolving out there. So the processes that are going on there, we posit that they're dynamic, they're evolving over time, and most of them are unobserved. They're latent from a statistical perspective. They're operating, they maybe contribute to and give rise to what we do see, but they're not directly measured. Okay? Now, in the statistical area, we're often working largely, maybe not always, but largely with observed quantities. We have data on the number of people presenting to the emergency room, the number of visitors, and the number of admissions. We have data on perhaps the number of discharges. These are observed quantities. We have data on the number of diagnosed cases of diabetes as judged by, pharmaceutical prescriptions, diagnoses reported in administrative data, and maybe based on procedure codes or what have you. These observed associations, the view here is that they're contingent on the nature of these underlying processes. There's some associations that are observed. And this is very important. These associations will change if the character and degree of the underlying processes change. So let me see if I could run a little example. And if anyone's interested in following along, you'd be welcome to do so, although I won't pause pause to make that happen. So what I'm going to sort of load in here is actually the very first model we ran. So it's this crowding disparities model. And I'm going to run it again just to remind you of an association here. So I'm running this out, and these graphs up at the top are populated, and we notice some regularities there. And take a look at this association. This is between, on the one hand, income, left to right, and the vertical axis, count of infections, okay? So there's an association here. We could characterize this association statistically in terms of these observables, right? Great stuff. So we could characterize it. Now, if I undertake an intervention here, maybe I undertake an intervention, for example, with say, two clinics in place. I'm going to run this here, and we'll go and take a look at this. Now we have a clinic treating these folks, particularly over here, and there's another clinic further out. So we're going to run this out, and now we have clinic treatment going on. So the individuals are flowing through these clinics, and some of them are being treated along the way. And if we go and we look at this graph, we'll find that it's changed a little bit. This association has been modified by that intervention. You now see this. It's interesting. This kind of we have this set of lower income people that have comparatively fewer counts here, and then we have this sort of group right here at that sort of income level, and we could go in and investigate why that is, or we could go look at additional interventions. One that we saw yesterday, for example, was with 3 clinics, and we saw that sometimes this could actually wipe out the infection altogether. And the association here is, of course, much more stochastic. It's much more sort of limited. We have a very different association between income and count of times infected. There's some even more striking ones if you were to run some of these interventions that come about because of the impact of that intervention. So the point here is, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to interventions, those interventions are affecting the outcomes in terms of observed associations. And when we're dealing with observables, the associations that we see will depend a lot on the particulars of the process. So these associations between one quantity and another will vary based on interventions we undertake, based on changes that may occur due to exogenous factors like changes in the economy or changes in the climate or what have you. So, the processes, the character of these processes, and the particulars of them in terms of their magnitude and so on, will change if we intervene upon the system or if it's in disequilibria. The patterns that you see between the association of waiting times and C-test levels will be different depending on the, whoa, okay, that didn't come out so well. I was hoping to show a graph there, but the point is that here we have associations that are modified by changes in the underlying system. So if we're trying to work with associations, we should recognize that some of those associations are quite fragile to interventions that we undertake. And in some cases of those interventions for that model, you'll see dramatically different changes of that association we were looking at between income and infection count. In general, if we're dealing with associations, we need to recognize that as we go forward, either because of interventions or because changes in other factors that are outside of our control, or because of disequilibria, the fact that the system is not in this sort of equilibrium, we will see changes in those associations as a result. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing associations, the reason that I was running, this model to show these associations earlier, is because I wanted to emphasize the degree to which they are used in the area of statistics. So the degree to which statistics rely upon the associations. So when we're dealing with traditional statistical models, they are typically designed to capture and describe, characterize these associations. So those betas that we have that come out of a regression model, those are characterizing the degree to which different independent variables are associated with changes to the dependent variable. And they're very powerful, but they are, because they're contingent on the underlying processes, and because these underlying processes may be changed if we intervene or if the system is not in equilibria, we may get rather different outcomes with some of these associations for different particular interventions. So the risk here is if we're purely dealing with statistical models, we're dealing with a situation where we're operating on assumptions based on observed associations. And in a way, it's kind of like trying to drive looking out the rearview mirror. If we're trying to anticipate what's coming up and navigate what's coming up, undertake interventions going forward, we're operating off of data from the past about associations which may change going forward. And so we're just hoping that the road forward is like that's behind us. Now, this works rather well if you're on a circular track. If you're on a situation where what's behind you is kind of similar to what's on going forward, you're in okay shape. If you're in a situation where you're operating in kind of a steady state of sorts, even a dynamic one, and you're trying to anticipate what's coming up, the past is a pretty good guide. But as they say in the financial world, past results are not necessarily indicative of future performance in many cases. So if we want to drive going forward in a way that is reasoning about the context of new interventions, which have never been examined before, if we're talking about modifying our healthcare system in important ways or our particular facility of interest in certain ways that affect our health region, putting in place bullet rounding, putting in place strategies for more effective ALC management, introducing a staged physician encounter process in the ER, handling off different responsibilities to paramedics. We don't want to be operating based purely on data that's gained from the past, about associations from the past, because those associations may be different. What's different here about dynamic models? How is that any different? Well, dynamic models seek to capture the causal structure of the system. They seek to move beyond associations between variables and rather characterize kind of the mechanics of the system, what influences what, how it works, a sort of theory of the system. And the insight here is that causal structure is more likely to be preserved going forward than the mere statistical associations. This structure is characterizing the underlying processes that give rise to those associations. What may be changing in the structure is the magnitude or degree, certain parameter things we capture as parameter values, but the causal structure is likely to remain more consistent. It's unlikely to vary wildly, and we can characterize a new causal structure or modifications to it if we want to characterize an intervention to anticipate how it's likely to change, among other things, associations or other outputs. So, if we're running a dynamic model, we can ask these counterfactual situations because we've captured how a change in A affects B and how B affects B, C and D, and how those end up affecting E, but also ripple through and affect A. by capturing this causal structure, we're able to more, with greater confidence, look forward in a counterfactual situation compared to an associational situation where we're dealing with associations observed when the system was a different way in the past. So, capturing causal structure in dynamic models is central to its enterprise because it supports reasoning more robustly about how system behavior, both observed and unobserved, changes when we examine these other situations, these situations that have never been observed before. And a very important class of counterfactual situations that's of central interest for this group, and for most people I talk to, is in fact dealing with the results of interventions. If we're talking about changing the system, bending those curves, nudging things for the better, we're talking about changing things so that what we see going forward is different than in the past. And dynamic models can be of central importance there because they allow us to reason about that what if, because they capture that causal structure. So if we think about dynamic models compared to regressions, which are a key part of our toolbox for other purposes, here people sometimes get confused. How is a dynamic model different than a regression where time is an independent variable? Time is one of these variables that's considered, as a component of the analysis. Another example that also falls in this, that is also people get confused about is, okay, suppose we have a survival analysis and we're considering the hazard function over time. How is that different from a dynamic model? Well, statistical models generally specify, there's several ways it's different. Statistical models generally specify some explicit functional form, a link function, that links the output with the independent variables, links the dependent variable with the independent variables. And that's an explicit functional form. So you may be doing a linear regression where time is a covariate. Time is one of the independent variables that's considered. But you're saying, okay, this is a linear, that we assume the output is a linear function of time, for example. That's okay. It's in a certain sense, you could think of it as capturing change over time. But here, this is an imposed functional form. We're assuming it's going to change linearly with time. By contrast, the dynamic model, we're not positing, we're not directly forcing into the model an assumption about how these outputs change over time. That results instead from the interaction of all these rules about how things change. Given your current state, how is the next state change from this current state? In models that are agent-based models like we've been looking at, we have these state charts that dictate that, right? We have a state chart that says if you're susceptible, you can get infected. If you're in a severe infective state, you can recover. In any of these states, you can become susceptible again through treatment. When I say that where you don't specify an explicit functional form for how many cases of infection there are over time, rather it results from this kind of implicit specification that says, given your current state, what's the next state? And from that, over time, emerges the count of people who are infected. We're not imposing, saying the count of people who are infected rises linearly with time. Rather, whether it rises or falls is a reflection of these interactions between these many components of the system that say, given how the current state is, what's the next state for this person, for example, or for this clinic? How does it evolve from here? Given your current situation, how does it evolve from here? You remember flows depend on stocks, and then the values of stocks are determined by those flows. We're not specifying the model's output is a sinusoid, but it may happen to be sinusoidal as a result of the different rules in the system. So here, the behavior over time, like in the external world, emerges from the interaction of many factors within the model. Does that make sense? We're not saying assume that the number of cases rises linearly with some beta. We're not assuming it rises in a sigmoidal fashion. We could do that in a statistical model, and there's no shame in that. But here, within a dynamic model, that's an emergent feature of all these different interactions in the system, whether it's stocks or flows, or these different factors within the system, rules for how people interact, etc. Now, there are a class of statistical models that seek to incorporate causal structure. They're sometimes called confusingly causal models, which is also a term confusingly given to dynamic models, although they're different types of models. And such models are getting closer to dynamic models. And we've worked with some of them in our work. And again, I'm not going to say there's going to be forever a solitude. All I'm saying is that traditional statistical models, like regression models, are quite different from dynamic models. At first blush, they may look similar. They may look the same or like they have many similar features. They output behavior over time, if time is an independent variable of a regression model. But they give different insights, and they are contingent on different factors. In statistical models, dealing with observables or observables in a small number of latent variables, as such as you might have in a path analytic model, you're dealing with associations and positing latent factors that might be involved in those associations. In dynamic models, you are explicitly aspiring to characterize the causal structure of the system so that you can ask about counterfactuals. Associations will typically change in counterfactual situations, or will change in many such counterfactual situations. The dynamic model results, because they're based on causal structure, can be robust to that. We can just pose the what if in terms of that causal structure and see the consequence in terms of the logical implications of our theory. I don't know if this is helpful. Do people find those comments helpful? Where do statistical models fit in? Lots of places. We use them in a fundamental way to estimate those parameter values in many cases. So I was being asked earlier about our diabetic end-stage renal disease modeling. And quite a few of the parameter values there were secured through a competing risks analysis conducted by a biostat student here. Others of those parameters might be estimated through survival analysis. In that same model, in fact, some associated with dialysis patient mortality. We teamed up with CORE, the Canadian Organ Replacement Registry. There's routine types of statistical analysis that might be used to estimate parameter values elsewhere in the model. Those are all great things, but those types of parameter values are far less likely to be affected by the counterfactuals we'll be investigating. So they're comfortably used for areas of the model which are not likely to be thrown off by the counterfactual situations we're investigating. And we wouldn't be able to do the sort of modeling we do without strong use of statistical methods. But for those situations where we're examining counterfactuals, modifications to the healthcare system, modifications to population health, we want a dynamic model so we can ask about counterfactuals. Make sense? Okay. So again, forgive the broad brush treatment. I'm happy to talk about this with anyone who's interested in going a little bit deeper or wanting more specifics, but those were my prepared comments on this front. Questions related to that? No? Okay, some food for thought. And now some thought for food. Well, some other food for thought. We're going to be going to the faculty club, and I think now would be a good time if UN is ready. Have you seen? You haven't seen her this morning. Okay. Let me check the timing we have down in our agenda here. She may be over there already. I thought I saw a glimpse of her. So what's that? Oh yeah, 12:45. Okay. So how many people would like a break here? Otherwise, I will hit what's next in the original agenda, which is on agile modeling. Question? Oh, Dylan? Dylan's welcome to present now if you're ready. Oh, okay. Sure. Would you like to do that?
Yeah. Do you want a breather and people want to see the model?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, or rather, my breather would like a break. So sure.
I'll hop on up here and
Okay.
deliver something.
Okay. That's great.